Welcome back, folks, to the Anchored Podcast. We have returning with us a special guest, the one and only Dr. Aaron Howard, professor at Lipscomb University, a member of the CLT Academic Board. Dr. Howard, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Glad to be here. You can call me Aaron, by the way.
Aaron, we're going to dig into some tricky stuff today, some complicated this ruling, the Supreme Court ruling against Harvard, against UNC Chapel Hill, and then what they had been doing in admissions. So we're going to get into this conversation, affirmative action, and all that good stuff in the conversation today. Folks, if you're just tuning in, you may want to go back and listen to the original podcast that we did with Dr. Howard. Dr. Howard, if you could, for our guests, give a bit of a refresher, your academic background, and then your current work at Lipscomb University.
Yes, I did the PhD at Vanderbilt in Ethics and Society in the Graduate Department of Religion. I have a master's from Fuller Theological Seminary in Theology and Biblical Studies. Did my BA from UCLA in Anthropology a long time ago. Right now, I'm professor of ethics, worship, and reconciliation at Lipscomb University, where I teach classes in graduate and undergraduate ethics. And I also consult with schools across the nation on issues, ironically, of diversity and belonging, but I do so from predominantly a biblical and Christian perspective.
So you've got a really unique background in that I mean, that's a lot of schooling at some of the most elite, prestigious, universities, a PhD from Vanderbilt. I have to imagine, and we talked a little bit about this in the first podcast, but folks finishing a PhD at Vanderbilt and remaining, Bible, Jesus loving Christians, it's probably not too common. Can you speak to that?
Or definitely not that common in the divinity school. They would say it's common because they have a liberalized understanding of what the faith really entails. But when you're talking about Orthodox evangelical Christianity, I would say there's not a lot of graduates from the divinity school, at least with PhDs, that still hold to an Orthodox understanding of the scriptures. And it was tough for me to
Wow.
survive there because the institution was arrayed against me. I felt like the institution took a stance against my progress and my success. And when you're an individual that's trying to take on a whole institution, usually you lose. But through a lot of prayer and we got put the right people in place throughout the university who were able to come alongside me and help me finish. But I think the problem was that I was contesting liberal ideology, the
Mm.
pro LGBTQ ideology of the divinity school and the marginalization of scripture as the authoritative word of God. I was pushing back against that in my dissertation, and I think that that ruffled some feathers and ended up making me a persona
Yeah.
non grata. But we made it through.
Well, I love it. And something I've just been thinking about a ton lately is really for so long, century after century, it was Orthodox Christians that essentially created academia. And we created the first universities. It wasn't until the late 1800s that really progressives kind of got a stronghold within academia and then kind of created a new orthodoxy. But I feel like that's beginning to break a little bit. Is it?
Yeah, I can't speak to that authoritatively or from a place of knowledge like I would like to. I hope it's beginning to break, but I would say that even in Christian universities, like recently we had Belmont University, who Promise Keepers was trying to do an event at Belmont University, which purports to be a Christian university, and Belmont canceled their event there because Promise Keepers put on a blog. They simply declared that
Hmm.
marriage should be between a man and a woman. And so you even have Christian universities who are capitulating
Wow.
to the progressive ideology. So that's what I'm saying. I don't know. Maybe it's beginning to break, but I can't say that I've seen that per se, because
Okay.
even in the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, there still is this infiltration of this progressive ideology, particularly around sexuality and gender, that I find problematic.
So I think for our audience, I mean, as a guy who I would describe as pretty conservative, especially you're theologically conservative, and as a black man who you are the only person I know who has actually read everything from this Supreme Court ruling. So
Not everything, because it's like 240 pages long.
okay,
If you
okay,
count Judge Jackson's dissent and Judge Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion. So I didn't read all of it, but I did read the opinion and Sotomayor's dissent. So
Okay.
100
Okay.
by 110 pages.
110 pages. Okay, I think I read about five. But for folks who maybe know, okay, we know that the Supreme Court, in a historic decision, ruled against what has already been the ongoing practice at Harvard, at UNC Chapel Hill. For folks who don't know much about us, give us some big picture context here. What were these universities doing that was found to be unconstitutional?
Well, the universities are taking into account race as a part of the application process. So when students apply, it's not the only factor, but it is one factor. They're using race as one factor in the application materials that they use to admit students. Like I said, obviously it's not the only one, but in a student's profile, holistically speaking, they're allowed to factor in race as a criteria or a criterion for whether or not that student is admitted. Meaning, if you have a student that academically is strong, also athletically, or other things, letter of recommendations and civic participation and leadership. If you have two students who are racially different, right, race can rank one student higher than another, even if some of those other areas are not as strong. Meaning, even if that student is not as strong academically or not as strong with letters of recommendation or with some of the other criteria that are being used. So in that way, the admissions representatives have been allowed to use race to balance the incoming applicants, meaning that those that are admitted, they're able to use race to ensure that that incoming freshman class is diverse. Because what they're arguing is that diversity is a good or end that they want to pursue and that is worthy of pursuit, meaning they're finding value in forming a class that is comprised of diverse backgrounds, perspectives, and racial identities. And so that's been the argument for many years, is that when colleges are trying to create this, usually the courts have said, hey, yeah, we're going to allow you to do that because we agree that that is a worthy pursuit or outcome.
So, Aaron, folks are gonna, I've read some of the dissent to this, and Twitter was on fire. I mean, on campus at Harvard, students, you know, uh, essentially in mourning, gathered together in groups, and they're viewing this, and essentially the way the conversation goes is something like this. They say, well, for generations and generations, from Jim Crow, but even before that, black families, black children they didn't have access to an education, and their parents didn't teach them to read in the way that maybe affluent white families taught their own children to read, and that historically these things, and so that was kind of the idea within affirmative action. And I think a lot of middle of the road people hear that argument and they say that makes sense. Can you speak to that? What becomes maybe problematic with this in practice?
Well, I think the first thing is that college education is accessible for everybody in America now. It doesn't mean you have to go to Harvard or Yale or University of Cal, Berkeley. State schools exist. California has a robust state university system. You have the UCs, but people forget there are a number of Cal State schools. And in many states, because of the landscape, the economic landscape that's affecting colleges, they accept 80 to 90% of all applicants that apply. So it's not like if Harvard doesn't have affirmative action, or if we're not allowing affirmative action, that black kids cannot go to college or Hispanic kids cannot go to college. You certainly can go to college, even to the point that community college in many states is free, right? And they have a
Totally.
program
Okay.
here in Tennessee where I am called Tennessee Promise, where basically your community college is paid for, right, by the state, which allows you now to then go on, if you want to transfer to a four-year university. So, we're acting like, first of all, that just because these elite universities or UNC or other universities are not allowed to use affirmative action, that all of a sudden the amount of minorities going to college is going to precipitously drop off. And I think that that's not a fair assessment of the situation. But I think, too,
That's a great point.
um,
Colleges are hungry for students right now. I think that's a great point.
yeah, I mean, there are so many colleges, right, that are, I mean, even when I was going to college, I mean, they recruit you. I mean, I had a trash bag that was full of college letters from colleges that
Sure.
were trying to recruit me. I mean, they're trying to find students. So many of these colleges are not in the business of turning people away, especially, like I said, with the economic situation that so many of them are in. Many even might maybe having to close their doors at some point in the near future because
Sure.
they just can't
Yeah.
keep enrollment up. So yeah, so I think that's an important point that we need to make. But even aside from that, I think this idea that Jim Crow and that somehow we need to change the standards for Black people, I find it to be I'm not, I guess offensive may be too strong of a word, but as an intellectual myself who scored well on standardized tests, who did well, who was raised off of 52nd Street in Crenshaw in a middle class, working class neighborhood, who came from a two-parent home. And the only difference between my home and the home across the street was that my parents kept me in church and ensured that I knew I could be anything that I wanted to be. They did not celebrate me graduating from high school as if I had some monumental achievement. They're like, that's what we expect from you. Where are you going to college? And where are you going to graduate school after that? They had high expectations. And my dad had a master's in fine arts. I saw my mom get her master's in educational administration from Cal State Dominguez Hills. And so we're losing the impact that culture has on how people achieve. Now, I'm not saying that the Black Americans have an impoverished culture. That's not what I'm saying. But if we don't take into account that Asian Americans achieve at a higher level, or Nigerian Americans who are the same color as me and who phenotypically look like me,
Yeah.
achieve at one of the highest levels of any ethnic group in the United States because of the culture and expectations that their parents have for them, we're losing something. So now we can ask, why is it that Black Americans oftentimes don't have these same kinds of standards? Well, that's a question that we need to pursue. And it's not about Black people being inferior. John McWhorter would say there are sociological and historical reasons for this, and we can engage that. But I don't think that saying it's racist to even ask that question is a way to really interrogate and investigate the argument. I think we need to look more closely at why is it that we are not finding the same kind of standards of achievement amongst Black children
You know,
in education. And I think that goes back to a lot of the single parent households and other things that we can
yeah.
talk about. But I think there are reasons for that. But to simply say, we're not teaching our children how to read because of Jim Crow, when we would even see back when we go back in time before school integration and things like that, that there was expectations for Black achievement in segregated schools. I don't think that argument holds weight.
And I got to tell you this story real quick. So my dad, he was a career ATF agent. He was in Waco for that. If you remember David Koresh, he was a
Yeah. Oh
cult
yeah.
leader. He was there for it burning down and everything else. And and I came home from LSU in 2002 for a Christmas break or something. And I said, Dad, why are you always been like against affirmative action? You know, and I've been learning about this as a college student. And I remember that conversation. He said, you know who the people I've met who are the most against affirmative action? He said, it's the highest performing Black agents that I have. And he said, the reason they hate it is because people assume they have a job with ATF because they're Black, when in reality, they were top of their class in college. And they were, they got there on merit, but affirmative action had created a culture where people assumed that maybe they got the job because of. I had never heard that before. I never even thought about that.
Yeah, let me be clear. There was a time in our nation when we did need affirmative action, and as the Supreme Court decision shows, that these race-based policies were meant to rectify past injustice and discrimination. So I agree that, yeah, we needed affirmative action. Now, the question is, do we need it now? Do we live in,
Mm.
is America truly a meritocracy, or is there the structural racism that prevents talented and educated Black Americans and other races from achieving in America? And that's where I think the argument needs to stay focused, or that's where we need to shine the spotlight, as it were. This idea that, well, we need to have diversity in higher education. Yes, I agree that we should have diversity in higher education, but at whose expense, right?
Mm.
Meaning, if there's achievement across the board from all of these ethnicities, by all means, then let them in, or grant them admittance into these institutions of higher education. But if we're talking about modifying the standards, right, that puts the onus on Black Americans and other minorities to prove they belong. Oftentimes, and I'm not making a blanket statement here, but if you don't succeed as highly because you didn't score as high on the SAT or the GRE, then now, there need to be these remediation programs in place that now set up, first of all, in the person themselves, a lack of self-esteem and a lack of confidence. But then two, you set up this kind of intrinsic hostility or skepticism toward that minority group because people are assuming that they're only there because of their race, which means now the race relations are going to break down. Now that person has to prove that I belong here. Now that may exist where you have to prove that you belong there because of societal racism anyway, but we're not helping matters by changing the playing field. And for someone like myself, I have confidence in any room that I go into because I know I work my butt off. I know I can intellectually hold my own with anybody, right? I studied 3 months, 2 hours a day for the GRE. I mean, I worked hard, right? I knew that I wanted to go to a PhD program. I knew that admissions were extremely rigorous and they only admitted a small percentage of all their applicants. And so I gave my best. And if I gave my best and it wasn't good enough, I would be okay with that, because education is
Yeah.
not designed to be elite education is not designed to be everybody gets in just because you want to be here, right? There is merit. I think of it like a track race. When I look at we're in the midst of the United States track and field
I've been all
trials,
over it every night. Yeah. Yeah.
those people that are running are the best in the nation at what they do. Imagine I said, well, Jeremy, we need more white people running. We have to make an allowance for you, brother. And then when
Yeah.
you get to the finish line and run, you come in dead last. I'm not saying you would, but I'm saying you come in dead last in a sprint race or something like that. Who does that really serve, right? Because that is about that's a true meritocracy. It's about the best
Mm.
at this particular skill. And now, it's an imperfect analogy. Education is not strictly that, but there's something about higher education that says intellectually, if you attend Harvard, you need to have the chops to succeed. And I'm not saying that black people don't have the chops because we do. What I'm saying is that those that have the chops that make it should make it because they have achieved at a high level, have worked hard and done the things to
Yeah.
prepare them.
So in some ways, the definition of racism has changed and completely almost. It's almost been reversed, right? Where for Martin Luther King and his generation, he is judge a man by the content of his character, not the color of his skin. We're in a moment right now where it's like if you don't take race into account, now that is being racism. So we've redefined it. Was the court interacting or responding to this kind of redefinition of what racism is?
I think indirectly there were, like in Sotomayor's dissent, she lifts up racial inequality as a reason that we still need race-based preferences. But what the court, I don't think, is buying is the fact that just because there's racial inequality, that does not mean that there's racism. If you have racism and racial disparities regarding income, home ownership, educational achievement, management positions, or success in corporations, that could mean that there's racism at play, but it could mean that there are different factors at play that are causing that particular outcome. What's going on with oftentimes from the left or from those that are proponents of affirmative action is anywhere they see racial disparities, they assume that there's some kind of structural racism that is producing
Mm.
what we observe. And that's where I think the court is saying, hey, if there is a specific act of societal discrimination that we can observe that's against the Constitution, then yes, race-based preferences are appropriate to remedy that. But they're saying we don't find that here. And how long are we going to look back to slavery or to some prior state of affairs or even Jim Crow to say that we need to continue these programs? They're saying by this logic, these programs will continue in perpetuity, meaning they will never end. And what they're saying is the intent of the law, the intent of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, and I believe it's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, the intent of that is to treat everybody fairly and equally and not to allow race to disadvantage certain people groups. And what they're saying is that if we're continuing to advantage a minority, right, then we're disadvantaging others, whether that be Asians or whether that even be white people who are achieving and who are meeting certain standards and are not gaining entry into institutions of higher learning because we're allowing race as a criterion to select certain
So let
people
me ask you
groups.
this: I mean, as a black man, as an academic, I mean, as a serious academic at a CLT partner institution as well at Lipscomb, do you find that the view that you're holding that the court here And I appreciate the nuance. You're saying, yeah, for a time, yes, affirmative action we needed. We're in a different time right now. Do you find that your view is in the minority? Do people think that you're crazy for being sympathetic to the court's ruling?
Where the court just ruled, so I haven't had a lot of time to really disseminate my views. But I would think that I probably would be in the minority amongst African Americans here on the campus or Black people here on the campus. I can't say that for sure, but I think that there are more and more Black people of high achievement, of firm morals and Christian beliefs, not just Christian beliefs, but beliefs in the truth of the gospel and beliefs in society and in what America really is truly supposed to be, that would say, hey, we agree with you, Aaron, right? That we don't need a separate standard, right, by which we're measured and judged. Because to me, that is implicitly racist. I don't need a separate standard. I only need a separate standard if you can prove that because of the color of my skin, I'm not going to be granted an opportunity. And as I said before, Nigerian Americans prove whether they're, the argument goes where they're already economically wealthy. They already have access to resources that others don't have. But if the argument you're making is that the structures are set up to discriminate against people from with West African phenotypes or West African features that come from West Africa, which from an ancestral perspective, I do, right, by and large. If you're saying that the structures are set up to prevent that kind of achievement and success, why are they successful? How are they doctors, engineers, lawyers, and pharmacists? How do they enter into these professions that are built on a meritocracy, meaning you have to achieve in order to be a doctor? You've got to pass these board exams. You have to pass the bar in order to be a lawyer. You have to get these certain scores in order to pass these engineering exams to be an effective engineer. How are they able to do that in America if somehow this country is still predisposed to block the success of Black people? At one time, that was true. It didn't matter how smart you were. It didn't matter how economically successful you were. The structures of America were set up that Black people could not get ahead. But I don't think that that's true now, and that's why I think that's why I hold this position. And so, I probably am in the minority. But like I said, there are more and more African Americans and Black people who are starting to hold this view.
It's such a true point. I with six kiddos, I like to get hurt sometimes. We go to the hospital our fair share for sure, and a number of times we've had Nigerian doctors, attending to our children. I'm wondering, what does it say about American education if if you have a Black doctor, and I don't know the percentages, but it's in my own experience, anecdotally, they've been immigrants from Africa rather than having grown up in the United States. What is going on in the American education system if Nigerian immigrants are way more successful than Black boys and girls who grew up here?
That's a complex question. I don't want to get in trouble, but there's a lot going on there. I think when you go back to slavery and you understand post Reconstruction, we had Reconstruction, and there was the Sotomayor even mentions that in her dissent. You had the Freedmen's Bureau, and you had programs that were designed to elevate Black achievement. Right, post Reconstruction, those programs were rolled back. Then you had the Great Migration, where you had Black people that were moving to the north, and then they end up moving into these ghettos because they weren't allowed to live where other people could live, and they were segregated. And so what you introduce is this cycle of poverty, this cycle of lack of achievement in the educational realm that is now perpetuated from generation to generation. Because the schools were substandard at the time, and so we're experiencing now the vestiges or the consequences of that, right? But whose responsibility is it once the legal protections for African Americans are ensured, which they have been through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Once you have these legal protections that say now we're removing the structural impediments to Black achievement, right?
Mm.
Whose responsibility is it? You can throw more money at the problem. You can throw more money at these school districts, and it's not going to change anything, right? Because the cultural factors that started back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, they're still they're still holding regnants even now, right? And so how do you push this cultural mindset back? And you don't have the government helping in the 1960s when
Mm.
you now have the welfare policies that subsidize single parent, single motherhood, or having a
Yeah,
single parent in the household. We've got 75 to 80% single parents in our communities, in the inner city communities, where in 1960, when the Moynihan report came out, it was 25%. And he was already
incredible.
saying, "Hey, here's the
And
problem."
I,
He was trying to help, right? But he
yeah,
was pilloried in the academic world. He was, I mean, he was demeaned. He was
yeah.
vilified for that point of view. And so now we're seeing the effects of that on academic achievement.
You know, when I graduated from LSU in 2004, and I was probably the most progressive as I'd ever been in my politics, when I graduated from LSU, but I went to go teach in inner city New York for 3 years. And during that time, this is a school 100% minority serving, Progress High School in Brooklyn. And I didn't meet a single family, not one, where the kid lived with two married biological parents. Everybody lived with usually an aunt or a grandma, for the most part, or maybe just a mom. The men were almost not in the picture, hardly at all. But I had a handful of students tell me, "Oh, my mom and dad are together, but my mom gets more money if they're not married." And that was the first time I thought, what in the world kind of legislation encourages the dissolution of the family, right?
Yeah.
Um, so you would look at some of these programs, and I think the ideas were noble as far as I know. I think that, Lyndon LBJ's Great Society and addressing these historical wrongs. But do you view the government and policy as one of the main culprits behind the uh, skyrocketing divorce rates? I mean, that have impacted every demographic, but particularly Black families.
Yeah, I would probably be more in line with Malcolm X and others that say, we can't rely upon the government. I mean, it even hurts me to have this conversation, Jeremy, because it makes it seem like the Black family is defective or something like that. And sometimes you want to have these conversations in group amongst your own race,
Mm,
because you don't want to expose yourself and give people fodder for racism and say, "See, look, Aaron even said it. This is the problem." So it's even tough for me to have this conversation, but I'm interested in truth, right? I'm interested in what's true. I'm interested in what's really going to help all of our society move forward and be really what God has called us to be as a nation, and what God has called us to be as people who love Him regardless of our ethnicity. So that's just a preamble to the next thing I want to say. I don't believe that I believe it's the church's job. And the church, we have abandoned our responsibility in
mm,
going into the inner cities and in coming alongside our young people and creating institutions, schools, creating educational institutions and nonprofit institutions and other pathways and possibilities where these young people can thrive, right? We've put it on the government and we expect the government to come in and save us, but the government
mm,
cannot legislate morality. The government cannot tell people to stop having sex before they're married. Enroll says that if you want to be successful in America, you should do these things. You should graduate from high school, get
yeah.
married, no, graduate from high school, get a job, then get married, then have a baby in that order. And he has people that do that in that order, by and large, can rise above poverty. What we find is that Black people that are in two-parent homes are better off oftentimes than white people that are in single-parent homes, right? We find that some of the economic disparities are lessened when you have the power of a family. And so I think, if we're asking the government to create strong families, that's not the government's role. The government's role is to remove the impediments to flourishing for all of the constituents of a society, which I think the American government has done. Now, the act of moral formation and virtuous formation, that's the role of the church, and that's the role of private institutions like Christian schools and others that are stepping into that role and doing that. And the problem is we in the African American community are not creating these institutions for our own people to the degree that we should be. We're relying on the government and we're ridiculing the public school system and the like. What does it take to start a school? It takes a church with some classrooms. Bring the kids in there and
Mm.
sit them down and say, "Hey, we're going to teach you, right, what you need to learn in order to achieve at the highest level." And that's where I think, like Michael X said, we should solve our own problems. Now, I don't want to set up this racial
Sure.
dichotomy, but that's where I see that some things are lacking.
Sure. Yeah. And let's talk school choice for a few minutes because I think this is all connected at the end of the
It
day.
is.
And some of the most encouraging moments I've ever had with just the whole CLT journey, touring schools like True North in Florida or Hope Academy in Minneapolis, schools that are serving majority minority populations, but especially given the experience I had in New York and seeing that we were failing these kids in a terrible way. And in some ways, Aaron, I would describe it as the population I was working with in New York, they were living in a world of suffering and brokenness, right? But the education they were receiving in no way even touched upon suffering, or it had no way to make sense of life. It was disconnected from meaning, almost completely. And it was just to this utilitarian end. This was why should you do good to get a good job, all right?
Right.
Well, the kid's thinking, I know how to make my money. I can think of ways to make money, right? We were failing to address the problem. So I'm optimistic about school choice. And what's so odd to me about this is that 20 years ago, this was folks on the left were very pro school choice, right? My wife did Teach for America in New York City. It was a very progressive organization. They were all about magnets and charters, and now it's become this. It's just such a partisan divide of like the right is now for school choice, and the left is that because of the unions. Are you optimistic, Aaron, about the future of school choice in America?
Um, that's a great question. First, I want to address something that you're saying. I think that for by and large in American history, the federal government has been on the side of Black Americans when we've made achievement and when there have been substantial gains. Um, the armed forces were the first um, federal department to desegregate, right? And so we've seen the federal government take the lead, even like you said, we talked about in Reconstruction with the Freedmen's Bureau, and then with desegregating the armed forces and the Supreme Court decisions. So the federal government has tended to be an ally of African Americans and Black folks in this country. And so oftentimes we see the government through lenses of we're amicable and we're more friendly toward the government. We see them as allies and partners, whereas in the right, it's like, hey, leave me alone. I'm an individual. Let me do my thing.
Yeah.
I can achieve on my own. And I think there's that complex history that we're often
Oh,
working with
okay.
regarding Black people. I mean, it was a Civil Rights Act that allowed us to go into public accommodations and be alongside our white brothers and sisters, right? So the government has often had to step in. So now when we see public education, these are the places that were hiring us when private white corporations would not, right? It was the
Yeah.
post office. It was the public school system. You can get a job as a teacher. You couldn't get a
Yep.
job as probably almost anything else. And so to now say, hey, public education is failing and we need to now go to some other alternatives, you're going against some cherished values and some norms that are pretty entrenched within the Black community. And so I think that's one of the things that you're up against. The public, like I said, the public school system and public institutions have been there when no one else has been there for us. But I think now we have to ask ourselves, have we come to a point in time when we have to look beyond the government and public institutions to get where we need to get, right? I mean, we can't do that forever. Sometimes things exist to a certain point to allow you now to achieve and thrive. So public education will always be there, but now we have to be more creative. And I think that's where I am excited about the future of school choice, because families are realizing, well, I've got to be more creative than just
Sure.
assuming that the only way for my child to get ahead is to go to the school down the street where they're not teaching them and where they're not learning the skills and habits necessary to thrive in this globalized world that's continuing to be more technologically advanced, and it's requiring skills that kids need.
Hey, Aaron, I want to ask you this question, and again, kind of born out of experience. It was such a formative time in New York City, but there was a teacher there, Dr. Wilkinson, Mr. Wilkinson, and he was one of the few folks in the school who grew up in Brooklyn, and he was a great teacher. All the kids loved Mr. Wilkinson, but I remember one time at lunch, faculty lunch, where he kind of got on to some of the younger progressive teachers, and he was saying to them, you're giving these kids a victimhood mentality. You're stripping agency away from them, and it was kind of awkward because you don't see adults kind of have this moment. But I thought, wow, this is an interesting moment. Here you have somebody who grew up in this community, and you've got these young 23-year-old coming right out of the university with these ideas, and they really were, America. They were introducing students to, structural systematic racism, these kinds of concepts. Um, do you see those kinds of ideas as widespread in American education? Sometimes, maybe folks on the right maybe will overblow, or that's what I hear. How pervasive things like CRT is in schools. Well, do you see that as a problem that spreads, that strips agency from black, a sense of agency from young black students?
I'm in Lipscomb University, and so I've been out of the public world for a long time. But just based upon the cultural zeitgeist and just based upon what I'm hearing, it's this idea that, post George Floyd, which was, I believe that was an act of racism, of police brutality. But post George Floyd, there's this idea that because we see that just America as a whole is this racist institution, and that it's not a meritocracy. And so if it's not a meritocracy, then what is it? Then white people are in the positions that they're in because they are white, right? It's not because of their intelligence, because they worked harder, or Asians or whoever it is, or black people like myself who are in positions where I earned a PhD. And so it's like, well, you slipped through the cracks or something like that. If you remove the idea of a meritocracy, then you got people that are waiting for a handout. So you got people that are using excuses for why they can't achieve and be what they want to be. But that's not what I find in the book of Proverbs. That's not the understanding that I find that represents the best of who America is, right? In Proverbs, the Bible tells us if you use wisdom, right, you can achieve, you can become wealthy, and you can have long life by following certain principles. I think at the heart of America, that's what Martin Luther King went back to. Hey, as the heart of America is this idea that if you work hard, if you're diligent, you have a certain kind of moral habits and a certain kind of disposition, you can make it. It doesn't mean that we can be an
Uh,
NFL billionaire. Might there be systemic racism at the highest levels? Yes, I still believe that systemic racism exists, but it's not by and large the major factor that prevents people from being able to live a good life in America, right? I don't believe white privilege is this thing. I live in a neighborhood with white working class people, white electricians, white plumbers. I mean, the, most people are in the
well,
world are trying to raise their families,
sure,
trying
yeah.
to have strong marriages. We're all Americans trying to make it. And so this idea that somebody owes us something goes against the fabric, I think, of who we are as a country. And I think that now that's where we're moving into, like, hey, if we're going to make it, there are no excuses. We've got to put our diligence forth and become what God wants us to be.
Aaron, I'm thinking as I hear you speaking about this magical providential flight that we shared together to Nashville. I missed my flight actually watching a track race, watching Juliet Whitaker in the 800. I wasn't going to leave the pub in Charleston until I watched her, and I knew I was cutting it close, and I missed it. But I got rerouted to Nashville, and I got to ride that first leg with you. We had a really memorable conversation that night. I am wondering this, and I love that you brought up the track analogy earlier, to say that let's use track that any attributes are inherent in one particular group, to say, for example, and I think I heard this, that there was one white person in the first 100 people to break 10 seconds in the 100-meter dash. One. So objectively that suggests there's like some kind of difference in terms of capacity. I feel like to even say that this thing that in some ways is like blatantly obvious is like inherently very racist. And so you can't say that kind of thing out loud, even though it's kind of right there in front of us. What are your thoughts are on that? I mean, I feel like we're so afraid to say anything that could be construed as racist that we sometimes can't, I don't know, thoughts there.
Yeah, well, the problem is if you say that, then what's the inverse of that, right? So the inverse is that if black people have an inherent athletic capacity to achieve in track and in basketball or football, then can white people now say we have an inherent intellectual capacity, right, to
Mm,
achieve that black people do not have? And that's why there are more white cultures. So that's where people get scared of the conversation, because it's like, well, what's the inverse, right? So we can say white men can't jump, and we can say, white people can't dance, they don't have a rhythm. But now if you say, well, what is it black people can't do, right? Well, if you say black people can't do anything, that's automatically inherently racist because of the past and because of the way these ideas have proliferated, right? The whole idea behind blacks
yeah.
being marginalized from education is this idea that black people are not as intelligent and so forth and so on. So I think there is a difference between bodily capacity and intellectual capacity, but scientists will have to bear that out. I think this conversation is probably too short for us to really delve deep into that. I do think that these are the conversations that we need to be having, though. I do think these are the conversations that we should not just say they're off the table because they elicit feelings of disgust or trepidation, or we're scared to go down that road. I think if we're going to pursue truth, as John Stuart Mill says, if we're going to pursue truth, we've got to be open to having these conversations, right? And is there something that's going on in the Black culture that's predisposing Black people to do as well on standardized tests? John McWhorter would say there are social and historical examples. I think studies have borne out that it's not intellectual, right? Because you can see with me and with others that if you sit kids down and teach them to study for the SAT, let me give you one other example because I'm talking a lot, but there's a study that shows across the world that any home that has 500 books, that child that's raised in that home has the equivalent of two parents with a master's degree, no matter what the education of the parents is.
Well,
All over the world. It's a book privilege, I guess you would call it. So if you grow up in a home with a whole lot of books, your outcome intellectually and professionally is going to be on par and high above those who did not have that particular privilege or that particular environment growing up. So that suggests that it's not an intellectual deficit, but it's more of a cultural or environmental deficit. And so those, I think, those are the conversations that we should have. But, so we have to ask if white people, yeah, I think that, like I said, I'm not skilled enough and knowledgeable enough to answer that question about athletics and things like that. But then you look at other things like baseball, where it used to be a lot more Black people in baseball, and now there are a lot more white people in baseball, and throwing a baseball is an athletic act. That's not easy, right? So I think there are ways to contest that. But I'm glad, Jeremy, you asked the question, and then we're having the conversation.
It's hard to be aware. You're not aware of your bias or prejudice or racism until you are. That's kind of the thing about inherent biases, that they're unconscious, they're subconscious. And I had this experience at LSU. It was actually a Nigerian exchange student, and he was over at our apartment, and we were all hanging out. And he saw the Scrabble board there on the table, and he's like, "Who likes Scrabble here?" I'm like, "I'm a Scrabble junkie. I love it." And I think I'm pretty good at Scrabble. I love playing. I grew up playing Scrabble with my mom, and he's like, "I love playing Scrabble too." So, and when you play Scrabble, it's a big deal to use all 7 letters. It's called going all out. And I only do it once every 5 or 10 games. This guy goes all out within the first 7 or 8 plays. The game is over. I've been annihilated, and it was my first experience. And he was there. He was a graduate student. He was there for some kind of graduate degree, med school or whatnot. So, but I feel like exposure is one of the best ways to kind of overcome, any inherent, racism. And last thing I wanted to chat about, Aaron, is just the way the culture has changed since the George Floyd summer. And I think especially even within the classical renewal movement. I mean, I think that summer and even the year afterwards, folks are saying, "Hey, why don't we have more Black families in our classical Christian school?" And I feel like now we're almost at a time where it's, to even ask that question, you get accused of being woke. I really do. It's really sad. I mean, everybody's terrified of being called woke right now, and so we're not asking some questions I think we should. Is that an overstatement? What are your thoughts?
No, I agree. But I think what's happened is that the DEI edifice and the DEI structure within America swung so far to the left that it precipitated a backlash that is overblown, but it's also completely understandable because, we charge people with being racist across the board. We make these blanket assumptions. We annihilated white people for privilege, and hey, if you push people into a corner, they're going to come out swinging, right? And so I think that's kind of what we've seen. We've lumped it in, and we've conflated LGBTQ issues with racial diversity, and people are tired of it.
How did that happen? Like, I mean, literally, yeah, it's wild. I mean, the fact that right now being not racist is supposed to somehow mean a man can have a baby, like it's that we're supposed to be for all of these things together is really wild.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
Again,
And now we're at a point, like you said, Jeremy, we're at a point now where in Texas and Florida, they've banned DEI programs and initiatives in higher education. But a lot of these programs are operating out of, I understand what critical race theory is. It's a legal theory that came out of the law schools in the 70s and 80s. And I understand what that was about. but it has the same beliefs as a lot of the DEI programs. They share the
Mm.
same beliefs about America not being a meritocracy, about structural racism being pervasive. And I think people are not wanting that to be taught to kids and the students. And so I do think that there is a valid reason for the pushback and for the hesitancy, but I think the hesitancy is now overblown. And it's giving now cover for racists to not want to
Mm.
do the hard work of
Wow.
integrating their institutions and asking the hard questions about
Wow.
why we don't have more diversity in our schools. And so I would challenge schools, ask the question and pursue diversity within your institutions so that all kids are prepared for higher education,
And
so that affirmative
yeah,
action is rendered unnecessary, so that the playing field is level. So I'm going to put the onus on the secondary institutions and the lower schools and the middle schools to do that work.
and Aaron, folks can reach out to you directly. I mean, part of your work is as one diversity, and I think for someone who's saying, you know what, two things are true. There's a lot of toxic nonsense in what people just broadly call woke ideology, and at the same time, you would be very hard pressed to find any head of school of any classical Christian school who doesn't wish they had, the black Christian family down the street come into their school, right? They want that family to come, and they're not always coming, And so I think there's a both and here. Yeah, we're here with Dr. Aaron Howard, professor at Lipscomb University. We're honored to have you, Dr. Howard, on the academic board at CLT. How can folks get a hold of you? You do consulting for a lot of classical Christian schools. How can folks reach out?
Reach out to me, Aaron Howard, PhD on LinkedIn, Aaron Howard at as1diversity.com. That's my email, Aaron Howard at as1diversity.com. And my website is as1diversity.com. You can reach out to me. Love to work with you and have more conversations about these kind of issues. And I love helping schools. See, what I do differently, and this is not really a plug, but I want to make this point, Jeremy, because this is important. And what's so funny about the flight that we were on is when we were on that flight, I was much more liberal, sociologically speaking and ideologically speaking, than I am now. But God has a way of really exposing you to different experiences. And so when I'm sitting next to you, I'm like, this conservative dude. I used to just look at conservatives and just roll my eyes like, these guys have no idea what they're talking about, and it's subterfuge for racist ideology. I mean, I had all these judgments toward conservatives, and really, God allowed a conservative to be in my own home, which was my son, who
Mm.
was a Trump supporter, and he went to a white private school, and we got into some heated arguments and discussions. We really were engaged in these vehement disagreements about the things that we're talking about even now. And one day my son said to me, he said, Dad, I think the difference between you and I is that you haven't grown up like me. He said, Dad, I haven't grown up with all the racism that you grew up with. He said, I haven't grown up in a world where I had to see it through this binary and through this lens of white
Mm.
and black, where the world has been against me and I've been disadvantaged because of my race. And when he said that, I had to think, Jeremy, about myself. And I said, wait a minute, I haven't either. I
Wow.
said, wait a
Wow.
minute, wait, what he's saying about himself is also true of me.
Mm.
What he's saying about himself is God allowed me, Jeremy, to grow up in a country where there were opportunities presented to me. I have 4 degrees. One of them I didn't mention at the top of the show, right? Because I'm like, hey, I figured mentioning 3 is enough. Where each of those degrees I achieved, right, through hard work, through dedication. I was allowed in UCLA because of affirmative action, but that's because I was lazy. It wasn't because I needed it, right? It's because I wasn't doing what I was supposed to do. But when I locked in and took advantage of the intellectual ability God gave me, I didn't get a B from the time I was in graduate school at San Diego State, earning a master's in education, through Fuller, all the way through Vanderbilt, right? And when I thought about that, I said, man, my son is right. I've been taught by the culture to think that America is inherently racist and that people are out to get me. There may be those people that are out there to get me, but when in fact God has been so good to me. And so when I sat there and had that conversation with them, that and then several other experiences, I work with heads of school, white heads of school across this nation. I had
Sure.
one head of school sit down with me, one pastor. I had a glass of water, and every time my glass of water was below half, he refilled it because there was water at the table. He didn't have to do that, right? This is a white man serving me. They pick up my plates and take them from the
Mm.
table. I'm not trying to be a white person apologist. All I'm saying is that the idea that I had about white conservatives and about people that voted for Trump, they're inherently racist. They're out to get black people. it turned out not to be true in my own experience. Maybe there are some people out there like that, but that's what I'm saying. I think that we need to have a more robust and charitable conversation like what you and I are having, where we sit down and really ascertain, like the church in Berea in Acts chapter 11, are these things truly true? So for me, I go to the scriptures because that's my belief system. And when I look at the scriptures, I see that God is no respecter of persons. He said, if you honor God, and in Samuel, he said, if you honor him, he'll honor you. And that's what I've seen to be true. I honor God with my life, and he's honored me. And that applies to every race, black, white, Asian, Hispanic. If you honor God and you use the principles of wisdom that God has given us in Proverbs and throughout the scriptures, he'll honor you.
And Dr. Aaron Howard, thanks for being with us. Come back again in the future. I could pick your brain all day, sir.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy. It's a phenomenal conversation. And thank you for the work that you're doing with CLT. Thank you for the work that you're doing to advocate for school choice and to provide an alternative way for kids to achieve and to be formed into students and young people of virtue and moral standing. That's a noteworthy role that you have, and I pray God's blessings upon you, your family, and the work that you're doing.